On their wedding night, she whispered to the CEO something he never expected. "I've wanted you for months." That confession changed everything between them. And what happened next, no one could have imagined. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what comes next will surprise you. The scent of magnolia blossoms drifted through the half-open windows of the Wentworth mansion, mingling with the warm breeze of a Charleston evening that seemed to breathe secrets. The honeymoon suite, decorated with antique tapestries and wrought-iron lamps that cast dancing shadows across the plaster walls, held a silence so dense that Thea could hear her own heartbeat thundering against her ribs. Her fingers trembled as they traced the edge of the ivory silk dress, that dress she had chosen without joy and which now weighed upon her body like an armor of lies. Through the balcony, distant notes of a jazz saxophone rose from some hidden courtyard in the historic district, and she thought that this mournful music understood her emotions better than any word she could speak. Sterling stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the amber light of the antique street lamps. He had removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, that gesture she had memorized during so many nights of silent observation, and his shoulders carried a tension that contradicted the apparent calm of his posture. They hadn't touched since the obligatory kiss at the ceremony, that brush of lips so brief and formal it could barely be called contact. Thea knew she should remain silent, that the prudent, the safe, the expected thing was to maintain the courteous distance they had established during months of preparation, that this marriage was a contract, a transaction, an agreement between families that had nothing to do with the heart. But something in the vulnerability of that night, in the forced intimacy of this space they must share, in the weight of all the secrets she had carried for so long, pushed her toward the precipice. "Sterling!" His name came out like a plea, and he turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers in the golden penumbra. In his face there was something she couldn't decipher, resignation, exhaustion, or perhaps something deeper that neither of them dared to name. "There's something I need to tell you," she continued, and her voice sounded strange even to her own ears, as if it belonged to another woman, a braver one who didn't fear the consequences of truth. "Before we spend this night pretending this is just a business arrangement, before we build more walls between us." He didn't respond, but took a step toward her, and that simple movement made Thea's heart race until it almost hurt. The light from the candles the hotel service had lit with ironic romanticism partially illuminated his face, revealing the tense line of his jaw, the questioning gleam in his eyes. "I love you." The words escaped in a barely audible whisper, laden with months of repressed longing, stolen glances, fantasies that should never have existed. "I've loved you for months, since before all this. Since before our parents decided our lives would be the currency of their business dealings." The silence that followed seemed to stretch like an ocean between them. Thea felt the air become solid. Time stop, each second that passed without response, a condemnation. She watched Sterling's face searching for signs, rejection, surprise, discomfort. What she found left her breathless. In his eyes there was something she had never seen before, absolute vulnerability, as if she had ripped off a mask he had worn for years. His lips parted, but no sound came from them. And then, very slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter the fragile crystal of that moment, he began to walk toward her. Each step he took seemed to cost him immense effort, as if he were fighting invisible currents. Thea held her breath, feeling how the space between them shrank, how the warmth of his presence began to reach her. When he finally stopped, they were so close she could perceive the scent of his cologne, mixed with something more personal, more intimate, the smell of his skin, of his truth. "Do you think," his voice came out hoarse, laden with an emotion that contradicted all the coldness he had shown for months, "that I accepted this marriage just for business?" The question hit Thea like an unexpected wave. She blinked, confused, while he continued speaking, each word falling like precious stones in the silence of the room. "I noticed you 8 months ago, Thea. 8 months watching you work late when everyone else had left. 8 months memorizing the way you bite your lower lip when you're concentrated on the numbers. 8 months seeing you smile at the night guards as if they were the most important people in the building. 8 months noticing how you rearrange the pens on your desk when something makes you nervous. She felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes, but she couldn't look away from him, couldn't miss a single word of this confession that was demolishing everything she thought she knew. And when my father mentioned your name as a candidate for this arrangement, Sterling paused, swallowing with difficulty. I said yes before he finished the proposal. Not because I cared about the business, not because I wanted to save the family empire, but because it was the only way I could think of to have you close without having to admit I wanted you. The world stopped, or perhaps it was just Thea's heart, which seemed to suspend in the air for an eternal instant, before beating again with renewed force. The tears she had contained began to slide down her cheeks, but they were no longer of fear or uncertainty. They were of a joy so intense it almost hurt. All this time, she murmured, I thought I was invisible to you. I thought I was just another employee, a convenient piece on your father's board. Sterling raised a hand and, with a delicacy that contradicted the hardness the world saw in him, wiped a tear from her cheek. His touch was warm, real, and sent an electric current through all of Thea's skin. You were never invisible, he whispered. You were the only thing I saw clearly amid all the noise. That night, there was no physical consummation of the marriage. There was something much more intimate. Two people sitting on the balcony of a Charleston suite, sharing truths they had guarded like forbidden treasures, discovering each other beyond the masks the world had forced them to wear. They talked until the sky began to lighten over the rooftops of Charleston, until the church bells announced a new day, until the scent of magnolia mixed with the promise of something neither of them yet dared to call love. But as the rising sun bathed the city in gold, Thea knew that whispered confession had changed everything. It was no longer just an agreement. It was no longer just a contract. It was the beginning of something real, fragile, and terrifying, but absolutely true. What neither of them could know was that truth, however liberating, also has the power to complicate things in ways we never imagine. The most dangerous ghosts are not those that inhabit abandoned houses, but those that live in the memories of those we love. The honeymoon in Newport began like a dream borrowed from another life. The hotel faced directly onto the cliff walk, and each morning Thea woke to the sound of waves breaking against the rocks, with the Atlantic light filtering through the linen curtains, with the still fragile certainty that what had happened in Charleston had not been a feverish fantasy. Sterling was different away from New York. Without the weight of board meetings and corporate expectations, something in him softened. They walked along the cliff walk at sunset. Him telling her stories of childhood summers in these same coastal towns, her discovering layers of his personality that the office had never allowed her to see. They dined at Ocean Drive restaurants, and Thea marveled at seeing him laugh with genuine joy when she tried to pronounce the names of New England seafood dishes. But it was on the third night that the first ghost appeared. They were dining at a restaurant overlooking the harbor, the scent of the sea mixing with the aroma of lobster bisque, when Sterling's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at the screen, and his face transformed instantly. The muscles of his jaw tensed, his eyes lost the warm gleam they had maintained for days, and a familiar shadow, one Thea recognized from work nights at the office, fell across his features. "What's wrong?" she asked, feeling anxiety begin to climb up her spine. "Nothing important," he responded, but his voice had lost all the warmth of previous days. "Just news from New York." She didn't ask more, respecting the space he clearly needed. But that night, while he slept restlessly beside her, she took her own phone and searched the day's news. What she found made her stomach contract painfully. Vivian Ashford Pierce breaks her silence about her ex-fiancé's surprise marriage, read the headline of a society magazine. Below, a photograph of a stunning woman with raven black hair and emerald green eyes, posed with studied elegance before the cameras. The image had been taken at some recent event, and Vivian wore a red dress that screamed power and sophistication. "It's understandable that Sterling would seek a convenient alternative after our breakup," the article quoted, "but I'm surprised by the speed with which he found a solution. I suppose when it comes to saving business empires, the heart takes second place." Thea felt each word was a dagger stabbing into the fragile confidence she had begun to build. She searched for more information, finding photographs of Sterling and Vivian at gala events at Lincoln Center, at exclusive parties in the Hamptons, at intimate dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. In each image, he looked at her in a way Thea didn't recognize, with a mixture of adoration and possessiveness that made her heart shrink. Had he been that intense with her? Had he ever looked at her with that absolute devotion? Or was she simply what Vivian suggested, a convenient solution? The next morning, Thea tried to act normally, but something in her behavior must have betrayed her, because during breakfast on the hotel terrace, Sterling set down his coffee cup, that cortado he always ordered but barely drank, and looked at her directly. "You've seen the news." It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to find words that wouldn't sound accusatory or insecure. "Thea," he extended a hand across the table, seeking hers. "What there was between Vivian and me ended more than a year ago, and it ended because I refused to keep living a lie." "A lie?" The word came out before she could stop it, laden with an irony she didn't intend. Sterling closed his eyes briefly, as if seeking patience or the right words. "Our engagement was also an arrangement," he admitted. "Her parents and mine had been planning it for years, but unlike us, there was never anything real between us. She wanted the Ashford name and access to the power it represented. I wanted to please my father and prove I could be the perfect heir. But after 2 years of pretending, I couldn't anymore." "And her?" Thea hated how vulnerable her own voice sounded. Was she pretending too? A shadow of something, guilt, remorse, crossed Sterling's face. "Vivian doesn't understand the concept of pretending. For her, everything is strategy. Every word, every gesture, every emotion she displays is calculated to obtain a result. When I broke the engagement, it didn't hurt her to lose me. It hurt her to lose the position she had planned to occupy. Then why is she speaking now? Why after so long?" Sterling released a long sigh, and in that sound Thea perceived years of accumulated exhaustion. "Because Vivian doesn't forgive and doesn't forget. My marriage to you represents everything she couldn't achieve. It's not about me, Thea. It's about proving she still has power, that she can still affect my life even though she's no longer part of it." Thea wanted to believe him. With every fiber of her being, she wanted to accept his words as absolute truth and let Vivian's ghost dissipate like mist in the sun. But the photographs remained engraved in her memory. The way he looked at her, the evident intimacy in their postures, the years of shared history she could never compete with. Did you love her? The question escaped before she could stop it, and once spoken, it hung between them like an unexploded bomb. The silence that followed was long, painful. Sterling didn't look away, but something in his eyes hardened, as if he were arming himself against the impact of his own response. "I thought I did," he finally admitted. "For a long time I thought what I felt was love, but now I understand it was only habit. Comfort, the illusion that if I did everything expected of me, I would eventually be happy. And now?" Thea barely recognized her own voice. "What do you feel now?" He leaned forward, taking her hand with a firmness that contradicted the vulnerability in his gaze. "Now I feel terror," he confessed, "because what I feel for you doesn't resemble anything I've experienced before, and that scares me more than any business crisis, more than any expectation from my father, more than all the ghosts of the past combined." Sterling's words should have reassured her, and in part they did. But as the Atlantic sun bathed the terrace, and the other hotel guests continued with their breakfasts oblivious to the silent drama at their table, Thea knew that Vivian's shadows wouldn't dissipate with a simple conversation. Ghosts of the past have a particular way of persisting, especially when they're determined not to be forgotten. New York has a way of reminding you who you are when the world is watching, especially when you've forgotten the world is always watching. The apartment in the Upper East Side was everything Thea had imagined, and nothing she expected. It occupied the top floor of a historic building, with high ceilings decorated with original moldings, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Manhattan skyline, and a terrace from which you could watch the sunset paint the city's rooftops orange. It was beautiful, elegant, impeccably decorated by some interior designer whose name probably cost more than Thea's annual salary as an employee. And it felt absolutely foreign. "You can change whatever you want," Sterling said, while showing her the rooms, perhaps noticing the rigidity in her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned the space without finding where to rest. This place was decorated to impress investors, not to live in. "If you prefer another style, other colors, it's fine," she responded, though both knew she was lying. The first week back in New York was an exercise in constant adaptation. Thea had submitted her resignation from the finance department before the wedding. It was inappropriate for the CEO's wife to maintain her position, and now found herself with empty days she didn't know how to fill. The domestic staff, a cook, a housekeeper, a driver she hadn't requested, but apparently came included with the marriage, treated her with an uncomfortable deference that made her feel like an imposter in her own life. Sterling left early each morning, sometimes before she woke, and returned late, when the lights of Manhattan already glowed against the night sky. He tried to compensate for his absence with gestures, flowers that mysteriously appeared on the dining room table, text messages during the day asking how she was, reservations at restaurants she never could have afforded before. But the physical distance was hard to ignore, and Thea began to wonder if the intimacy of Charleston and Newport had been just a mirage, a parenthesis that wouldn't survive the test of routine. The first lunch with the wives of other executives was a disaster veiled in polite smiles. It was held at an exclusive restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place where the tablecloths cost more than a month's rent, and the waiters spoke in reverent whispers. Thea arrived dressed in her best, a navy blue dress her mother had given her for special occasions, but one glance at the Valentino ensemble worn by the CFO's wife was enough to know she was completely out of her element. "So you're the famous Thea," said Caroline, the vice president's wife, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We've heard so much about you." "Oh, really?" Thea tried to keep her voice neutral, though something in Caroline's tone suggested that what they had heard wasn't necessarily flattering. "Of course, it's not every day someone from the finance department ends up marrying the CEO," intervened another woman, Madison, whose last name Thea didn't remember but whose jewelry suggested she didn't need to work a single day in her life. It must have been an interesting promotion. The words fell like acid, and Thea felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wanted to defend herself, explain that her marriage wasn't what they imagined, that there were real feelings involved. But how do you explain the truth when the truth itself is so complicated? "Sterling and I met in professional circumstances," she finally said, choosing each word carefully, "but what we have now has nothing to do with work." "Of course not." Caroline exchanged a look with Madison that Thea couldn't decipher. "No one is suggesting otherwise. It's just that, well, it's an unusual situation. Vivian Ashford Pierce was practically family. Her breakup with Sterling was a surprise to all of us. Vivian's name fell on the table like a grenade, and Thea felt the air become denser. Of course, these women knew Vivian. They had probably attended the same parties, frequented the same circles, shared confidences that now became weapons. "Circumstances change," Thea responded, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. "People too." The rest of the lunch passed in barely disguised tension. The other women talked about vacations in Nantucket and limited edition handbags, about exclusive schools for their children, and renovations of second homes in the Hamptons. Thea nodded at appropriate moments, smiled when it seemed necessary, and counted the minutes until she could escape. When she finally arrived at the Upper East Side apartment, she locked herself in the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes, releasing all the humiliation and insecurity she had contained for hours. What was she doing? In what world had she believed she could fit into this universe of inherited privileges and social codes no one had taught her? That night, when Sterling arrived home, late, as always, he found Thea sitting on the living room sofa, looking at Manhattan's lights without really seeing them. "How was the lunch?" he asked, loosening his tie as he approached. She considered lying, saying it had been pleasant, that the other wives were lovely, that everything was perfectly fine. But something in the Charleston confession had broken a dam inside her, and she could no longer rebuild walls of falsehoods. It was horrible, she admitted, They made me feel like an intruder, like I had stolen something that didn't belong to me. Sterling sat beside her, and in the apartment's penumbra, his face showed a mixture of rage and guilt Thea didn't expect. What did they say? It's not what they said. It's how they said it. The looks, the silences, the constant references to her. She didn't need to pronounce the name. Both knew who she meant. "I'll speak with their husbands," Sterling said, and there was steel in his voice. "This won't happen again." "No," Thea took his hand, stopping him. "I don't want you to intervene. I don't want to be the wife who needs her husband to defend her. I just need time. Time to find my place in all this." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. "You don't have to find a place, Thea. You don't have to fit into any mold those women or anyone else has designed. You already are exactly who you should be." The words were beautiful, but as he embraced her on that too elegant sofa, in that too perfect apartment, Thea couldn't help wondering if it would be enough. If love, because that's what she was beginning to feel, a love that grew with each shared day, could survive the constant pressure of a world that seemed determined to remind her she didn't belong. Trust is like glass. It can take years to build, but a single moment to shatter it. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, while Thea was having breakfast alone on the terrace. Sterling had already left for a meeting with Asian investors, and she was checking her phone without much interest when she saw the notification from Ashford Corporation's legal department. "Your immediate presence is required at the main offices for a meeting related to an internal security investigation." Thea's heart stopped. A security investigation? What could she have to do with something like that? She had left the company months ago, had turned in all her credentials and access, had closed that chapter of her life. An hour later, she sat in a conference room on the executive floor, surrounded by faces she knew from her time as an employee, but who now looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Across the table, Sterling occupied his usual place at the head, but his expression was that of the CEO, not the husband, professional, distant, impenetrable. "3 days ago," began the security director, a bald man with a severe gaze named Marcus, "we detected a leak of confidential documents related to our expansion strategy in Latin America. These documents appeared in competitors' hands mere hours after being distributed internally." Thea listened without understanding what this had to do with her. She hadn't had access to any company documents in months. "After an exhaustive investigation," Marcus continued, "we traced the leak's origin. The documents were accessed and downloaded using credentials from the finance department. Credentials that, according to our records, belong to you, Mrs. Ashford." The surname hit her like a slap. Mrs. Ashford. It was the first time someone had called her that in a context that wasn't social, and the contrast between the CEO's wife title and the implicit accusation in Marcus's words was almost absurd. "That's impossible," she responded, fighting to maintain calm. "I turned in all my credentials when I submitted my resignation. I haven't had access to any company system since then." "The records show otherwise." Marcus slid a folder toward her, full of screenshots and access logs. "Your username and password were used to access the leaked documents exactly 5 days ago." Thea looked at the papers without being able to process what she saw. There was her username, her credentials, dates and times of access that made no sense. For the first time since entering that room, she dared to look directly at Sterling. What she saw in his eyes destroyed her. There was doubt, a small doubt, almost imperceptible but absolutely present. He knew her, knew who she was, had shared her most intimate secrets. And yet, in that moment, a part of him wondered if she was capable of betraying him. "It wasn't me," her voice came out weaker than she intended. "Sterling, you have to believe me. I don't know how this happened, but I had nothing to do with it." The silence that followed was endless. The other executives exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly more interested in the personal drama unfolding before them than in the investigation itself. "The investigation will continue," Sterling finally said, and his voice was so neutral, so devoid of emotion, that Thea felt something inside her break. "Meanwhile, I suggest you cooperate fully with the security team." "Cooperate? Suggest." He was speaking to her as if she were just another suspect, not his wife. not the woman to whom he had confessed his deepest fears just weeks before. The days that followed were the most difficult Thea had experienced. The investigation advanced slowly, and although no one had formally accused her, the atmosphere in the Upper East Side apartment had become glacial. Sterling spent even more time at the office, and when they were together, an invisible distance had installed itself between them. She tried to talk to him, explain, defend her innocence. But each conversation ended the same, him saying he trusted her, but needed to let the investigation follow its course, her feeling increasingly alone, more betrayed, more lost. It was Grandmother Cordelia who gave her the first hint of hope. During a late-night phone call, while Thea cried in the bathroom so Sterling wouldn't hear her, the elderly woman mentioned something she had heard in a family conversation. "Your husband's sister, that Lorelei, she's always been problematic. Your mother told me she was excluded from the business succession years ago, and she never got over it." Thea knew Lorelei only by sight, a woman in her 30s who occasionally appeared at family events, but always kept her distance. Sterling barely spoke of her, and when he did, it was with a mixture of sadness and frustration that suggested a complicated history. The next day, Thea began her own investigation. She reviewed old emails from her time as an employee, searching for any interaction with Lorelei or her associates. What she found left her frozen. Months before the wedding, someone had requested a credential verification for her username, claiming to be from the Human Resources Department. The request had been processed, meaning someone had had access to her login information without her knowledge. She presented her findings to the security team, which deepened the investigation. 3 weeks after that initial meeting, the truth came to light. Lorelei Ashford had used Thea's abandoned credentials to sabotage her own brother. Her motivation was as simple as it was devastating. If Sterling failed sufficiently, perhaps the board would reconsider her exclusion from the succession line. Thea's exoneration was complete, but the damage was done. When Sterling arrived home that night, he found his wife sitting on the same sofa where he had consoled her weeks before, but this time her gaze didn't seek comfort. It sought answers. "You doubted me." The words weren't an accusation, but a statement of a painful fact. "In that conference room, I saw the doubt in your eyes, after everything we shared, after Charleston, after every truth we confessed. A part of you thought I was capable of betraying you." Sterling didn't try to deny it. He sat across from her, with the weight of guilt visible in every line of his face. "All my life I've been taught to distrust," he finally said. "My father, business, this world. Everything has conditioned me to see threats everywhere. When I saw your name on those documents, my first instinct was to protect the company, and I hate that that instinct was stronger than my trust in you." "And now what?" she asked, because she genuinely didn't know the answer. "How do we move forward knowing that when things got difficult, your first reaction was to doubt me?" The silence that followed was long and painful. Outside, Manhattan's lights glowed indifferent to the human dramas unfolding behind its windows, and in that too elegant apartment, two people who had begun to build something real faced the first true crack in their foundation. Trust, once broken, can be repaired, but the scars always remain. Sometimes the greatest distance isn't measured in miles, but in shared silences. The days following the investigation's resolution passed in a kind of emotional limbo. Thea and Sterling cohabited the Upper East Side apartment like two satellites orbiting the same planet, close but never touching, following parallel trajectories that seemed destined never to meet. He rose before dawn, his silhouette barely visible in the bedroom's penumbra, as he dressed with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had repeated the same ritual thousands of times. She pretended to sleep, listening to the whisper of fabric, the soft click of the door, the footsteps receding down the hallway. Only when the elevator sound indicated his departure did Thea allow herself to open her eyes and face another day of polite loneliness. Shared meals had become exercises in empty courtesy. "How was your day?" "Fine, thanks." "And yours?" Questions without substance, answers without truth, the kind of conversation two acquaintances might have in an elevator, not two people who had promised to share their lives. Thea found refuge in the only thing she had left, her volunteer work. Before the credential scandal, she had begun collaborating with a foundation that helped young women from struggling families access higher education. Now, with all the empty time her new life as a wife provided, she immersed herself in that work with an almost obsessive intensity. The foundation's headquarters was in a modest building in the Lower East Side, light years away from the glass skyscrapers where the Ashford Empire operated. There, no one looked at her with the condescension of the executives' wives, or with the residual suspicion of employees who had witnessed her interrogation. There, she was simply Thea, a woman with financial knowledge who could help other women navigate the scholarship and aid system. One afternoon, while reviewing scholarship applications in the small office they had assigned her, one of the foundation's beneficiaries came to find her. Her name was Emma. She was 22, and her story was a painful mirror of what Thea's life might have been if circumstances had been different. "Can I ask you a personal question?" Emma said, sitting in the chair across from the desk with the shyness of someone unaccustomed to asking. "Of course. You're married to someone important, right? I read it in the magazines." Thea felt a knot in her stomach, but nodded. "And are you happy?" The question was so simple, so direct, so impossible to answer with the truth that Thea was left speechless for several seconds. "Why do you ask?" Emma shrugged with that mixture of vulnerability and hardness that characterizes those who have had to grow up too fast. "Because you come here every day. You spend hours helping us, reviewing papers, searching for opportunities for us, and I wonder, if you have a life as perfect as the magazines say, why do you need to be here?" The honesty of the observation hit Thea harder than any veiled insult from the Midtown wives. Because Emma was right. Truly happy people don't flee their homes to fill the void with volunteer work. They don't count the hours until they can return to a place that feels less and less like home. That night, for the first time in weeks, Thea arrived at the apartment before Sterling. She sat on the terrace, watching the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky with oranges and pinks that seemed to mock the grayness of her emotional state. When she heard the front door open, she didn't move. Sterling found her there with an untouched glass of wine in her hand and her gaze lost on the horizon. "We need to talk," she said, without turning to look at him. He sat in the chair beside her, leaving a space between them that seemed to symbolize everything that had gone wrong. "I know," he responded. "We can't keep going like this, living like roommates who barely tolerate each other, avoiding each other in our own home, pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. What do you suggest?" Thea finally turned to look at him, and for the first time in weeks, she really saw him. The exhaustion in his eyes, the new lines of tension on his forehead, the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight. Sterling was also suffering, in his silent and contained way. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know that if we continue down this path, we're going to destroy the little we built, and I don't want that. Despite everything, despite the doubt and pain and distance, I don't want to lose you." The words hung suspended between them, a confession that was costly to pronounce but necessary. Sterling closed his eyes, and when he opened them, there was something different in them. Not professional coldness nor contained guilt, but a vulnerability Thea hadn't seen since Charleston. "Me neither." His voice was barely a whisper. "But I don't know how to fix this. All my life I've known exactly what to do in every situation. Negotiations, business crises, board conflicts. I have a protocol for everything. But for this," he gestured to the space between them, "I don't have any manual." For the first time in weeks, Thea felt something resembling hope. Not because they had a solution, but because at least they were talking. At least they were admitting there was a problem. At least they were looking each other in the eyes instead of avoiding each other. "Maybe we don't need a manual," she said. "Maybe we just need to start over. Get to know each other again, without the pressures of the agreement, without the shadows of the past, without anyone's expectations, but our own." Sterling looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression began to soften. "How do we do that?" "I don't know," she repeated. But this time there was a small, fragile smile on her lips. "But I think it starts with staying here on this terrace and talking. Really talking, like we did that first night in Charleston." And that's what they did. They talked until the stars appeared over Manhattan, until the night's cold forced them inside, until words began to weave bridges over the abysses that had opened between them. It wasn't a magical solution, it wasn't an instant happy ending. But it was a beginning. Sometimes beginnings are all we need. True love isn't the kind that avoids storms, but the kind that learns to dance in the rain. The reconstruction began with small gestures, almost imperceptible to anyone observing from outside, but monumental for two people who had forgotten how to be close to each other. It started with breakfasts. Sterling began waking up 15 minutes later, enough to share coffee with Thea before leaving for the office. They didn't talk about anything important, the weather, the news, the day's plans. But the simple act of sitting together, of looking each other in the eyes while morning sun entered through the dining room windows, was a silent declaration of intentions. Then came the dinners. Once or twice a week, Sterling made the conscious effort to arrive home at a reasonable hour, and together they prepared simple meals following Grandmother Cordelia's recipes that Thea had memorized from her childhood in Connecticut. The Upper East Side apartment's kitchen, designed more to impress than to be used, began to smell of garlic sauté, of fresh herbs, of the aromatic spices Thea cultivated in small pots on the terrace. One night, while Sterling tried for the 5th time to make a sauté without burning it, Thea watched him from across the kitchen island with a smile she couldn't contain. "What are you laughing at?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the smoking pan. "At you, the CEO of one of the most important corporate empires in America, defeated by a little onion and olive oil." He lifted his gaze, and for an instant Thea saw the man she had met during those late work nights, someone who could laugh at himself, who didn't always need to have control, who was capable of being human beyond his title. "My father never cooked a single day in his life," Sterling said, returning to concentrate on the sauté. "For him, those were staff tasks. I grew up thinking the kitchen was a place where one gave orders, not where one learned. And now?" He remained silent for a moment, stirring the onions that were finally beginning to brown correctly. "Now I think my father missed many things by being so proud, like the smell of a house where someone is cooking, like the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands, like," he paused, searching for the words, "being present in the small moments that make life worth living." Thea felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she didn't know she had been carrying. This was the Sterling she had glimpsed that night in Charleston, the one who hid behind board meetings and quarterly reports. And seeing him emerge little by little was like watching something bloom that she had given up for dead. The following week, he surprised her with an unexpected proposal. "I want to take you to Bar Harbor," he said during one of their new shared breakfasts, "to my family's summer house. Not the elegant one in the Hamptons we use to impress clients, but the small, old one, where I spent childhood summers before everything got complicated." Thea knew that house only by reference. Sterling had mentioned it during his nocturnal confessions in Charleston, describing it as the only place where he had ever felt truly free. That he wanted to share that space with her meant more than any luxurious gift could express. They arrived in Bar Harbor on a Friday afternoon, when the main sun was beginning to descend over the blue waters of the Atlantic. The house was exactly as he had described it, modest, a bit ramshackle, with walls whitewashed by years of sun and salt, and a small terrace that led directly to a rocky cove. There was no domestic staff, no close neighbors, no comforts Thea had begun to associate with life alongside Sterling. Just the two of them, the sound of the waves, and the aroma of wild rosemary growing among the rocks. That first night, sitting on the terrace with a bottle of local wine and a plate of bread and cheese, Thea felt something fundamentally change between them. Without the distractions of New York, without social obligations, without the ghosts haunting them in the city, they could finally see each other clearly. "Why didn't you ever bring me here before?" she asked, watching the stars begin to appear over the sea. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "This place is. It's like a sanctuary for me, the only place where I can be just myself, without the weight of the surname, without expectations. Bringing you here was like exposing myself completely, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that." "And now?" He turned to look at her, and in the moon's silver light his eyes shone with something Thea was beginning to recognize as true love. "Now I believe that if I don't risk being vulnerable with you, I'll never have the chance to be completely happy. The words floated between them like a promise, and Thea knew they had crossed an invisible border. They were no longer two people trying to make an arrangement work. They were two people actively choosing each other, with all the risks that implied. The days in Bar Harbor passed in a kind of temporal bubble. They swam in the cove at dawn, cooked together with products they bought at the town market, read in silence on the terrace while the midday sun warmed the stones. Sterling taught her to sail in the small boat his grandfather had left moored in the harbor. Thea showed him how to identify the constellations her father had pointed out to her as a child. One afternoon, while walking through the town's cobblestone streets, they passed in front of a small art gallery. In the window there was a painting that stopped Thea in her tracks. Two intertwined figures, painted in shades of blue and gold, looking toward an infinite horizon. "It's beautiful," she murmured, more to herself than to Sterling. He looked at the painting for a long moment, and then at her. "Wait here," he said, and before she could protest, he had entered the gallery. He emerged 10 minutes later with the painting carefully wrapped. "For our apartment," he explained at her look of surprise. "Or rather, for our home, because I think it's time it stopped looking like a showroom and started feeling like a place where we truly live." The return trip to New York was different from the departure. Something had healed during those days by the sea, something the worst moments of the investigation or the weeks of distance hadn't been able to completely destroy. Trust, that fragile creature they had hurt, was beginning to breathe again. But the real world has a way of reminding us that vacations always end, and what awaited them in New York would test everything they had rebuilt. Ghosts of the past have infinite patience. They always find the perfect moment to reappear. The first sign that something had changed arrived in the form of an invitation, a cream-colored envelope, high-quality paper, impeccable calligraphy. Vivian Ashford Pierce requested the honor of their presence at an intimate dinner at her Greenwich estate. The date was 2 weeks away, and the attached note was written by hand in elegant script that seemed more threat than courtesy. "Dear Sterling and Thea, it's been too long since we had the opportunity to get to know each other properly. I believe it's time we left past misunderstandings behind and started fresh. With affection, Vivian." Thea read the note 3 times, feeling her stomach contract with each word. The final affection sounded particularly sinister, a warning disguised as fondness. "We don't have to go," Sterling said that night when they discussed the invitation. "I can invent any excuse. And give her exactly what she wants. Show that she intimidates me." He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You don't have anything to prove, Thea. Not to her, not to anyone. But maybe I have to prove it to myself," she responded, and knew it was true. "I can't spend my life running from your past. If we're going to make this work for real, I need to be able to face whatever comes, including Vivian." The dinner was exactly as uncomfortable as Thea had anticipated, but in ways she didn't expect. Vivian's estate was spectacular, a neoclassical-style mansion surrounded by impeccably maintained gardens, with an infinity pool that seemed to merge with the Connecticut horizon. Everything about it screamed old money, inherited sophistication, the kind of elegance that can't be bought but must be born into. Vivian received them at the door with a smile that didn't reach her green eyes. She wore a simple black dress, but one that probably cost more than Thea's entire wardrobe combined, and her dark hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders. "How wonderful that you could come," she said, kissing Sterling on both cheeks with a familiarity that made Thea clench her fists. "And you must be the famous Thea. I've heard so much about you." The same words Caroline had used months before, but spoken with more refined poison. The dinner was an exercise in elegant torture. Vivian dominated the conversation with the skill of someone who had attended hundreds of social events, weaving anecdotes about trips to exotic places, mutual acquaintances Thea didn't recognize, memories of events Sterling had attended in another life. Each story, each reference, each shared laugh was a subtle reminder of everything Thea didn't know, hadn't lived, could never compete with. But the worst came with dessert. "You know," Vivian said, bringing a spoonful of tiramisu to her lips with studied slowness, "I always admired Sterling for his capacity for adaptation. When circumstances change, he always finds a way to turn the situation to his advantage." "What do you mean?" Thea asked, feeling she was treading dangerous ground. Oh, nothing in particular, Vivian smiled with false innocence. Just that when our engagement ended, many of us thought it would be devastating for him. But look at him now, married to a lovely woman, the company better than ever, everything perfectly resolved. It's almost as if he found exactly what he needed, at the exact moment he needed it. The implication was clear as crystal. Thea was a convenience, a practical solution, a means to an end. The words were a perfect echo of the deepest fears she had tried to bury. Vivian, Sterling's voice cut through the air like a knife. I think it's time we made something clear. He placed his napkin on the table with a deliberate gesture, and when he spoke, his tone was that of the CEO who made entire boards tremble. My marriage to Thea is none of your business. It never was. And these little gatherings where you try to sow doubts or cause discomfort end tonight. Because what I have with her is more real than anything you and I ever shared, and I won't allow you to contaminate it with your bitterness. The silence that followed was deafening. Thea saw Vivian's mask crack for an instant, revealing something raw and wounded beneath, before composure returned to its place. I was only trying to be kind, Vivian said, but her voice had lost all its venom. Build bridges. Bridges are built with good intentions, Sterling responded, standing. What you were building was a trap, and we're not going to fall into it. He took Thea's hand, and together they left the mansion without looking back. In the car on the way home, neither spoke for several minutes. Thea watched Manhattan's lights passing by the window, processing what had just happened. Finally, it was she who broke the silence. You didn't have to do that, she said. Defend me like that. Confront her. Yes, I did, he responded, without taking his eyes off the road. I should have done it a long time ago. I should have made it clear from the beginning that I wasn't going to tolerate anyone treating you as if you were less, that I wasn't going to allow the past to keep poisoning the present. And now, he briefly turned his head to look at her, and in his eyes there was a determination Thea hadn't seen before. Now, Vivian knows exactly where we stand, and if she tries something like this again. He left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning was clear. That night, when they arrived at the Upper East Side apartment, Thea felt something had definitively changed. Sterling had chosen her publicly, without ambiguity, without reservations. He had faced his past for her, and although she knew ghosts never completely disappear, at least now they had less power. They stayed awake until late, sitting on the sofa with Manhattan's lights shining through the windows, talking about everything and nothing. And when they finally went to sleep, Sterling embraced her with an intensity that said more than any words. Sometimes the most important battles aren't won with grand heroic gestures, but with simple declarations of loyalty, in the moments that matter most. The deepest crises don't come from outside. They're born in the heart of what we value most. The call came on a Thursday morning, while Thea was preparing the coffee they now shared each day as a small sacred ritual. Sterling's phone rang with that particular insistence that presages bad news, and she watched his face transform as he listened, passing from curiosity to incredulity, from incredulity to horror. What's wrong? She asked when he hung up, though something in his expression told her she didn't want to know the answer. The Asian investors, his voice sounded hollow, as if coming from very far away. They're withdrawing their financing. Everything. Without prior notice, without negotiation, they're simply leaving. The implications fell on Thea like an avalanche. She knew Ashford Corporation's numbers. She had studied them for years as a finance department employee, and knew exactly what losing that backing meant. Without the capital injection the Asian investors had promised, the Latin American expansions Sterling had worked years to develop would crumble. Worse still, the debts contracted to finance the first steps of that expansion would be left without backing. Is there any reason, she asked, though she suspected the answer would be complicated. Any problem with the market, with projections? Sterling shook his head, and when he looked at her there was something broken in his eyes. Vivian. Her father has connections with the investor group. It seems last week's dinner was more vindictive than we thought. The weight of the revelation crushed them both. The confrontation that had seemed like a victory now revealed itself as the trigger of a war they hadn't foreseen. Vivienne hadn't just wanted to humiliate Thea, she had been preparing a much more devastating blow. The weeks that followed were the most difficult Thea had experienced. Sterling practically disappeared into a whirlwind of crisis meetings, emergency calls, and desperate negotiations. He arrived home past midnight, with increasingly deep circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that seemed loaded with stones. The shared breakfast disappeared, the dinners together became distant memories, and the distance they had worked so hard to close began to open again. But this time was different. This time Thea understood why. "Let me help," she told him one night when she found him in the apartment study, surrounded by financial documents and cold coffee cups. "I know those numbers, Sterling. I worked with them for years. Maybe I can see something others aren't seeing." He looked up, and for a moment it seemed he would reject her offer, tell her this was his problem, his company, his burden. But something in his gaze stopped him. "I don't know if there's anything to see," he admitted, running a hand over his exhausted face. "Every scenario we propose ends the same. Without that capital, we can't cover obligations. And if we can't cover obligations—" "You'll lose everything," she completed softly. "I'll lose everything." The words hung floating between them, laden with a meaning that went beyond the numbers. Because if Sterling lost the company, what remained of the original agreement that had united them? What sense did their marriage make if it no longer served to save the family business? As if reading her thoughts, he spoke again. "If this collapses, if I lose the corporation and there's nothing left to protect," he swallowed with difficulty, "I would understand if you wanted to leave. The agreement we signed would no longer have any." "Stop!" Thea interrupted him, with a firmness that surprised them both. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." She approached him, taking his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her directly. "Listen to me well, Sterling Ashford. I didn't marry a CEO. I didn't marry a corporate empire. I didn't marry a commercial contract." Her voice trembled with the intensity of her emotions. "I married the man who taught me to make sauté in a too-elegant kitchen, the man who took me to his sanctuary in Bar Harbor because he wanted to be vulnerable with me, the man who defends what he loves even if it costs him everything." The tears she had contained for weeks began to fall, but she didn't stop. "If tomorrow you lose everything," each word cost but was necessary, "if not a single dollar or share or title remains, you would still be you, the man I love, and that man is all I need." Sterling looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if every word she pronounced was remodeling his understanding of the world. "Do you love me?" he asked, and his voice sounded so young, so vulnerable, so different from the magnate the world knew. "I love you," she confirmed, and the certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. "I've loved you since before this began. I loved you through suspicions and distance, and I'll love you when all this ends, whatever the outcome." He embraced her then with a desperation that spoke of all the fear and pressure he had been containing. And in that study full of crisis documents, surrounded by evidence of an empire in danger, two people found something more valuable than any fortune. They found the certainty that whatever happened, they weren't alone. Before dawn always comes the darkest hour, when the entire world seems to have forgotten about light. The fever arrived without warning, as things that change the course of our lives tend to arrive. Sterling had spent 3 consecutive days practically without sleeping, traveling between New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, in a desperate attempt to find alternative investors who could save the corporation. Thea had worked alongside him, analyzing numbers, identifying possible allies, refusing to let him face the crisis alone. But the human body has limits, and Sterling had surpassed them long ago. The night of the storm, he was driving back from Boston when the sky opened. Rain fell with a violence that turned the highway into a river, and somewhere between New Haven and New York, he stopped seeing the road and had to pull into a service station to wait for it to let up. Thea didn't know about the storm until he arrived home, soaked to the bone, shivering in a way that had nothing to do with cold. She found him in the apartment's entrance hall, leaning against the wall as if his legs had forgotten how to support him. "Sterling," she ran to him, feeling the abnormal heat radiating from his skin. "You're burning up." "I'm fine," he murmured, but his eyes were glassy, unfocused. "I just need to To rest a moment. He wasn't fine, he was very far from fine. Thea called a private doctor who confirmed what she already suspected. Extreme exhaustion, an infection his weakened system hadn't been able to fight, a fever of almost 104 degrees, absolute rest, fluids, medication, and above all, no additional stress. The first hours were terrifying. Sterling burned and shivered alternately, moving restlessly between the sheets while the fever robbed him of control of his own body. Thea installed herself at his side, changing cold compresses, administering medications, holding his hand when the chills became too intense. It was at the fever's peak that he began to talk. Loose words at first, fragments of imaginary conversations with people who weren't there, and then confessions that darkness extracted from the deepest part of his subconscious. "I'm not enough," he murmured, with closed eyes and forehead pearled with sweat. "I was never enough for him. The empire, the expectations, the surname. Everything weighs more than me." Thea knew he was talking about his father, about the constant pressure of inheriting a legacy he never asked for, about the sensation that his value as a person was inextricably linked to his business performance. "The company, if it fails. If I fail." His voice broke. "Nothing will remain. I'll be nothing." "Shh." She caressed his hair, trying to transmit a calm she barely felt. "That's not true. You're much more than the company. Thea." He opened his eyes, but she wasn't sure he really saw her. "I don't deserve you. I never deserved you. You are light, and I'm only obligations and failures." The words of delirium revealed wounds she hadn't known, fears he guarded so deeply that even she hadn't been able to glimpse them. And as the night advanced and the fever followed its course, Thea held the hand of a man who was facing demons no business success could ever exorcise. Toward 4 a.m, the fever finally began to subside. Sterling fell into a deep sleep, his breathing becoming more regular, his face losing some of the tension he had carried for weeks. Thea didn't move from his side, too exhausted to sleep, too worried to leave. It was then that she made a decision. She had been hesitating for days, conscious that what she was considering could be seen as interference, as overstepping boundaries she shouldn't cross. But she no longer cared. If there was anything she could do to ease the burden that was destroying the man she loved, she would do it. The consequences could wait. She took her phone and wrote a message. It was for her father, the man whose financial ruin had initiated this chain of events months ago. She knew he had connections, contacts from decades in the business world in New England, that perhaps, just perhaps, could offer an alternative to the desperation they were sunk in. "Dad, I need your help. Not for me. For Sterling. Please." The response arrived in less than an hour, and with it the first light of hope they had seen in weeks. When Sterling woke the next day, weak but lucid, he found Thea asleep in the chair beside the bed, her hand still intertwined with his. Midday light entered softly through the windows, and for a moment, before memories of the crisis returned to assault him, he allowed himself simply to look at her. This woman, who had appeared in his life as part of a business arrangement, had stayed at his side when everything was collapsing, had held his hand during the darkest night, had listened to his deepest fears and hadn't fled. Perhaps, he thought while watching her sleep, perhaps he had been measuring the value of things with the wrong metric his whole life. The wounds we show are doors we open. Not everyone is worthy of crossing them. Sterling's recovery was slow, but his pride's recovery was even more difficult. During the days following the fever, while his body regained strength, his mind fought a different battle. He knew he had spoken during the delirium. Fragments of what he had said returned to him at unexpected moments, like splinters embedding themselves in his memory. He had exposed fears he had never admitted aloud, insecurities he had buried so deeply he barely allowed himself to recognize them before himself. And Thea had heard it all. For the first time in his adult life, someone had seen beyond the armor he had built for himself, and he didn't know how to feel about it. One afternoon, while resting on the living room sofa following the doctor's strict orders, Thea sat beside him with 2 cups of chamomile tea. There was something in her gaze that indicated the conversation he had been avoiding had finally arrived. "How do you feel?" she asked, though both knew she wasn't referring only to his physical health. "Like I've been exposed," he admitted, because lying no longer made sense. "Like you've seen parts of me that not even I wanted to recognize." "And does that bother you?" The question was direct, without accusation or judgment, just genuine curiosity to understand what he was processing. "I don't know," he responded honestly. "All my life I was taught that vulnerability is weakness, that showing fear is inviting failure. My father—" He paused, searching for words. "My father built his empire on the image of unbreakable strength, and I learned that was the only way to survive in this world. And now?" He looked at her, and in his eyes there was genuine confusion, as if he were trying to reconcile contradictory truths. "Now I realize that that strength has cost me almost everything. My health, my peace of mind, the possibility of real connection with another person. Almost everything? I haven't lost you," he said, and there was astonishment in his voice, as if he still couldn't believe it was true. "You saw the worst of me, heard my most pathetic fears, and you're still here." Thea took his hand, that simple gesture that had become their particular language of love. "Sterling, what I saw that night wasn't weakness. I saw a man who has carried impossible expectations his whole life, and who finally allowed himself to admit the weight was too much. That's not pathetic. It's profoundly human. And if I can't fix this?" The question escaped before he could stop it, laden with all the fear that still consumed him. "If the company sinks and I lose everything my family has worked for during generations, then we'll face it together," she responded with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "And we'll build something new, something that's ours, not inherited." He closed his eyes, letting the words penetrate, trying to believe it was possible. His whole life he had defined his value based on what he could produce, achieve, maintain. The idea that someone could love him independently of all that was so foreign, so contrary to everything he knew, that he struggled to process it. "There's something I need to tell you," Thea said then, and there was a note of nervousness in her voice that made him open his eyes. "I did something while you were sick, something I perhaps should have consulted you about first." She told him about the message to her father, about the connections he had activated, about the conversations underway with a group of Boston investors who might be interested in a different alliance than the one they had lost. "I don't know if it will work," she concluded. "I don't know if they'll be willing to invest enough, or if the conditions will be acceptable. But I needed to do something. I couldn't sit idle watching you destroy yourself when there was any possibility, however small, of helping." Sterling listened in silence, processing the information. A part of him, the part raised by his father, wanted to protest. She had acted without consulting him, had involved third parties in the corporation's affairs, had made decisions that didn't correspond to her. But another part, one that was beginning to gain ground, recognized something different. She had seen a problem and had acted. Not for ambition, not for her own benefit, but because she loved him and couldn't bear to see him suffer. It was exactly what a life partner should do. "Thank you," he finally said, and the two simple syllables contained more than he could express. "Aren't you angry?" She seemed genuinely surprised. "I should be, according to the rules I grew up with. But it turns out those rules have brought me nothing but loneliness and exhaustion. Maybe it's time to try something different." She smiled, and in that smile there was relief, hope, and something deeper neither of them yet dared to fully name. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Sterling sat up slowly, taking her hand. "We prepare the best proposal of our lives, together." It was the first time he had used that pronoun that way, together. Not him alone against the world, not her supporting from the margins. Together, as equals, as partners, as life companions in the truest sense of the term. And although the future remained uncertain, for the first time in a long time, Sterling felt that perhaps, just perhaps, everything could turn out well. The best opportunities often come disguised as the most improbable situations. Negotiations with the Boston investors began a week later, in a conference room overlooking the Charles River. Thea insisted on being present, and to everyone's surprise, including Sterling's own, her knowledge of the finance department proved invaluable. "These numbers don't match what you presented in the first round," she pointed out during a break in discussions, reviewing documents the investors had shared. Growth projections assume 30% market penetration in the first year, but with current infrastructure, the maximum viable would be 20. The silence that followed her observation was eloquent. The investors exchanged glances, and the group's leader, a silver-haired man named Robert, slowly nodded. "You're right," he admitted. "We adjusted projections to make the proposal more attractive. It's common practice in these negotiations." "Common practice doesn't mean intelligent practice," Thea responded without looking away. "If we base this alliance on inflated numbers, we're building on sand. In 2 years, when expectations aren't met, both parties will be blaming each other, and the relationship will have deteriorated irreparably." Sterling watched her with a mixture of pride and amazement. This was a facet of Thea he had barely glimpsed in her days as an employee. The brilliant analyst, the strategist with an eye for detail, the negotiator who wouldn't be intimidated by corporate tactics. The fact that she was using those skills to defend his company, to fight alongside him, made his heart swell with an emotion he could barely contain. Negotiations extended for 3 intense weeks. There were moments of tension, deadlocks that seemed irresolvable, early mornings in hotel rooms reviewing contractual clauses, but gradually an agreement began to take shape. It wasn't exactly what Sterling had had with the Asian investors. It was better. Because this agreement had been born of transparency, of real numbers and honest expectations, and because it included something the previous one didn't have, a genuine commitment from both parties to make it work. The day the final documents were signed, in that same conference room overlooking the Charles River, Sterling felt a weight he had carried for months finally lift from his shoulders. The company was saved. The expansion could continue. The family legacy would remain intact. But more important than all that, he had achieved it in a different way. Not alone, not crushing his health and relationships on the altar of success. He had achieved it with Thea at his side, trusting her, letting himself be helped. That night, they celebrated with a quiet dinner at a small restaurant in the North End, far from Michelin-starred establishments and New York's social pressures. The wine was local, the food simple but delicious, and conversation flowed with an ease that spoke of the intimacy they had built through crises. "I couldn't have done it without you," Sterling said, raising his glass. "And I don't just mean the negotiations. I mean everything. Keeping me sane when I wanted to give up, believing in me when I had stopped doing so, showing me there's another way to live." "I didn't do anything special," she responded, but her cheeks had flushed with the compliment. "I just did what anyone would do for someone they love." "No," he shook his head. "Not anyone. I know this world, Thea. I know the people who inhabit it. Most would have fled when things got difficult. Most would have taken advantage of the crisis to negotiate better terms for themselves. You stayed, you fought for us." She held his gaze, and in her eyes there were tears she didn't try to hide. "Because us is worth it," she whispered. "Because what we have, what we've built through all this chaos, is the most real thing I've known in my life." Sterling took her hand across the table. And in that simple gesture there was a promise that the future, whatever it might be, they would face together, that the days of loneliness and distrust had been left behind, that the love that had been born from a business arrangement had transformed into something infinitely more valuable. Leaving the restaurant, they walked through the North End's cobblestone streets under a starry sky. Boston glowed around them, full of life and possibilities, and for the first time in months the future didn't seem like a threat, but an adventure. "You know what I've been thinking," Thea said, as they passed in front of the Old North Church. "We've never had a real honeymoon. I mean, Newport was beautiful, but it was full of Vivian's ghosts and unresolved tensions. What do you propose?" She smiled, and there was mischief in her expression. "Nothing, just an observation, though. If you wanted to take me somewhere special to celebrate this new beginning, I wouldn't object. Sterling stopped, turning to look at her under the antique street lamp's light. I'll take you wherever you want, he promised. Italy, Greece, the end of the world, if that's what you desire. But first, there's something I need to do. Something I should have done a long time ago. What? You'll see, he responded, and kissed her under Boston's stars, sealing a promise he hadn't yet spoken, but that already lived in every beat of his heart. To build a solid future, sometimes we must close the doors we left open in the past. The reunion with Sterling's father was inevitable. Harrison Ashford, founder of the empire his son had fought to save, demanded a meeting as soon as he learned the crisis had been resolved. Not to congratulate, of course, that wasn't his style, but to evaluate, criticize, and probably find flaws in the way the situation had been handled. The meeting took place in the old family mansion on the outskirts of Greenwich, an imposing building that had always intimidated Thea on the few occasions she had visited. Harrison received them in his study, a room full of portraits of ancestors and business trophies, seated behind a mahogany desk that seemed specifically designed to make anyone on the other side feel small. So you managed it, the patriarch said without standing to greet them, though not in the way I had planned. No, Sterling responded, and Thea noticed there was no deference in his voice, only a calm that spoke of internal battles already won. Not in the way you had planned, in a better way. Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to his son contradicting him. Better. You lost the Asian investors. You had to resort to contacts from... He looked at Thea with something resembling contempt. Your wife to save yourself, and you almost ruined your health in the process. All of that is true, Sterling conceded, but I also built a more solid alliance based on transparency and not on inflated numbers. I learned to accept help when I needed it instead of destroying myself trying to do everything alone. And I discovered there are things more important than maintaining the image of strength you always demanded of me. The silence that followed was so dense it could be cut with a knife. Thea held her breath, feeling the tension between father and son like an electric current in the air. Your mother would be disappointed, Harrison finally said, and the words were calculated to wound. She believed in tradition, in family honor, in maintaining the standards that have defined us for generations. My mother, Sterling's voice hardened for the first time, died convinced she would never be enough for you. She spent her whole life trying to meet impossible expectations, and when she got sick, you were too busy with corporate mergers to be at her side. So don't you dare use her memory as a weapon against me. Thea had never heard Sterling speak this way about his mother. In all their conversations, the topic had been avoided, treated with silences that spoke of unprocessed pain. Seeing that wound exposed now before the man who was apparently responsible for it allowed her to understand dimensions of her husband she had barely glimpsed. I came here out of courtesy, Sterling continued, standing, because despite everything you're still my father, and I wanted you to know the company is safe. But I didn't come to ask for your approval. I no longer need your validation to know who I am or what I'm worth. Harrison looked at him with an expression Thea couldn't completely decipher. Was it rage, surprise, or perhaps, very deep down, something resembling respect? And her, the patriarch gestured at Thea with a dismissive wave. I suppose she's responsible for this change in you. She has a name, Sterling responded, and there was steel in his voice. It's Thea. She's my wife. And yes, she's largely responsible for me being here today, healthy, at peace, with a future worth living. Something you could never give me. He turned toward Thea, offering her his hand. Let's go, we've said what needed to be said. As they walked toward the exit, Harrison's voice stopped them one last time. Sterling. He turned, but didn't return to the desk. Your grandfather. He also defied his father. Also chose his own path when expectations became unbearable. There was a long pause, laden with unspoken things. Perhaps there's more of him in you than I wanted to see. It wasn't an apology. It probably never would be. But it was something. A recognition, however small, that perhaps, just perhaps, there was another way to see things. In the car on the way back to Manhattan, Thea took Sterling's hand on the gear shift. Are you okay? He didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the road, but she could see the internal work developing in his expression. "I don't know," he finally admitted, "but I think I'm better than I've been in a long time." Saying those things, confronting him, it was something I needed to do years ago, and now that I did it, he shrugged. "I feel lighter, like I've dropped a weight I didn't even know I was carrying." She squeezed his hand, transmitting without words all the pride and love she felt. "Then this is another beginning," she said. "Another ghost-faced." "Yes," he gave her a look that contained worlds. "And I'm beginning to think that with you at my side, I can face anything." True love isn't proven in moments of happiness, but in the conscious decision to choose each other again and again. A year had passed since that night in Charleston. A year of crises and reconciliations, of faced ghosts and forged alliances, of small daily moments that had woven a deeper intimacy than either had believed possible. Thea had found her place, not as the CEO's wife sitting at uncomfortable lunches with women who despised her, but as director of the Educational Foundation. She had started supporting as a volunteer, and now led with the same passion Sterling dedicated to the corporation. The foundation had grown, helping hundreds of young women access opportunities that otherwise would have been denied them. Sterling had learned to delegate, to trust his team, to not sacrifice his health or relationships on the altar of professional success. Shared breakfasts had become a sacred ritual, dinners together a constant even in the busiest weeks, and weekends in Bar Harbor a regular refuge where they left behind the professional world's masks. But something was missing, something both felt but neither had dared to name. Their wedding anniversary fell on a perfect spring day, with New York's sky clear and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming lindens. Sterling had planned something. Thea knew by the way he avoided her questions about the day's plans, by the secret messages with his assistant, by the mysterious smile he couldn't contain. The surprise was a trip, not to an exotic destination or a luxury resort, but to a small town in Vermont, to the little chapel where Grandmother Cordelia had married decades before. The same place the elderly woman had mentioned in her advice about true love, the place where stories began not with grand promises, but with small commitments cultivated day by day. "I don't understand," Thea said when they arrived, looking at the stone chapel surrounded by century-old maples. "Why here?" Sterling didn't respond immediately. He took her hand and guided her toward the small chapel's interior, where afternoon light entered through colored glass windows, creating patterns of gold and ruby on the ancient wooden pews. "A year ago," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "we got married in a ceremony with hundreds of guests, with business contracts as backdrop and family expectations as main reason. It was legal, it was official, it was everything the world expected." "I remember," she murmured, not knowing where this was leading. "But it wasn't real," Sterling continued. "Not in the way that matters. We got married because our families needed it, not because we chose it. And although everything that came after, the confession, the crises, the love we built, although all that was more real than anything I've known, I always felt something was missing. A conscious choice. A declaration that we're here not because we have to be, but because we want to be." He knelt then before her, in that empty chapel where only stone saints and afternoon light were witnesses. "Thea, I don't have a new ring to offer you. The one you wear is enough. I don't have business promises or contractual agreements. I only have this, a year of loving you and being loved by you. A year of discovering that the person you are is the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. A year of understanding that the best deal I ever made was saying yes to an arrangement that ended up being much more than that." Tears ran freely down Thea's cheeks, but she made no attempt to stop them. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Not out of obligation, not for convenience, not for anyone else but us. Will you choose me as I choose you, today and every day that comes after?" The answer didn't need words. Thea fell to her knees before him, taking his face in her hands, kissing him with all the emotion she had accumulated during a year of transformations. "Yes," she whispered when they finally separated. "I chose you a year ago in Charleston, when I confessed what I felt without knowing if you felt the same. I chose you every day during the crises, when it would have been easier to give up. I choose you now, not because I have to, but because there's nothing in this world I desire more." They married that afternoon in an improvised ceremony with a local pastor grandmother Cordelia had contacted, because of course she was involved in the surprise. The only witnesses were the elderly woman, Thea's father, and Lorelei, yes, Lorelei, who had spent the last year reconciling with her brother after the truth about the sabotage came to light. There were no Society magazine photographers, no guests representing business alliances, none of the pomp that had characterized their first wedding. Just two people who had found each other for the wrong reasons and had built something right against all odds. When they left the chapel, the sun was setting over Vermont's fields, painting the sky with the same orange and pink tones that had witnessed their original confession in Charleston. Grandmother Cordelia waited for them with a smile that spoke of wisdom, accumulated through decades of observing love in all its forms. "I told you once," she reminded them, embracing them both. "The best love stories are born from the most improbable circumstances, but you've surpassed them all. Love isn't a destination we reach, but a path we choose to walk together, one step at a time." 3 years after that second wedding in Vermont, the Upper East Side apartment had stopped being an impersonal showroom to become a true home. The painting from Bar Harbor, the one Sterling had bought in an impulse that symbolized his first step toward vulnerability, occupied the place of honor above the fireplace. The walls were full of photographs, stolen moments from their travels, family portraits that now included Grandmother Cordelia with her wise smile, snapshots of foundation events, where Thea appeared surrounded by the young women she had helped, and in the center of everything, in the bedroom they had redone together when they decided each space of their life should reflect who they were now. A crib of light wood awaited its first occupant. Thea woke that spring morning with dawn light filtering through the curtains and the certainty that something had changed. The weight in her belly, already considerable after 8 months of pregnancy, had shifted, and there was a different, more urgent pressure. "Sterling," she whispered, touching his shoulder gently. "I think it's time." He woke instantly, adrenaline erasing any trace of sleep, and in his eyes there was a mixture of terror and joy Thea found endearing. "Time? Already? Are you sure?" Questions tumbled out as he jumped from the bed, searching for the bag they had prepared weeks ago. "How do you feel? Does it hurt much? Can you walk?" "Calm down," she smiled despite growing discomfort. "I've been preparing for this for months, and you've read every book about childbirth that exists. We're ready." But the calm of her words didn't completely reflect what she felt. Because this moment, this step toward a new stage of their lives, was different from everything they had faced before. Business crises, ghosts of the past, trust rebuilding, all that had been difficult, but known. This was completely new territory. The journey to the hospital passed in a fog of intermittent contractions and conversations attempting to distract from underlying fear. Sterling drove with one hand, while the other held Thea's, and when they arrived at the clinic, a team of professionals awaited them, alerted by calls he had made on the way. The hours that followed were the most intense of Thea's life. Pain came in waves, each stronger than the last, and there were moments when she doubted her own capacity to continue. But each time she faltered, Sterling was there, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, reminding her she was stronger than she believed. "You can do this," he told her, with the same conviction he had shown during the most difficult negotiations. "You've overcome things that would destroy anyone. This is just another challenge, and like all the others, you'll conquer it." And he was right. When the newborn's cry filled the room, Thea felt something fundamentally reconfigure inside her. All the pain, all the uncertainty, all the fears, dissolved in the instant they placed her daughter on her chest. She was small, wrinkled, with dark hair wisps reminiscent of her father, and eyes that, though they hadn't yet defined their color, looked at the world with a curiosity that spoke of infinite possibilities. "She's perfect," Sterling whispered, with tears running freely down his cheeks without any attempt to hide them. "Absolutely perfect." "Cordelia," Thea said, looking at her daughter with a love so intense it almost hurt. "Her name will be Cordelia, for the person who taught me that true love grows in shared silences and small kindnesses no one else sees." Sterling nodded, unable to speak, and in that gesture there was a promise. that this girl would grow up knowing a different kind of love than what he had experienced, a love without conditions, without impossible expectations, without the constant shadow of judgment. Later that night, when visits had left and the hospital had fallen into that particular quietness of nocturnal hours, Thea lay in bed with Cordelia asleep in her arms and Sterling seated at her side, refusing to let go of her hand. "Do you remember that night in Charleston?" she asked, watching her daughter sleep. "When I confessed I loved you and didn't know if you felt the same." "Every detail," he responded. "The scent of magnolia, the sound of the jazz saxophone from the street, the absolute terror that you would pull away when I told the truth." "I never imagined we'd get here," she continued. "When I accepted this marriage, I did it thinking it was the end of my dreams, a necessary sacrifice to save my family. I never thought—" Tears began to form in her eyes. "I never thought it would become the beginning of everything I always wanted." Sterling leaned in, softly kissing her forehead, then Cordelia's, and finally her lips. "Me neither," he admitted. "I spent years convinced that love was weakness, that vulnerability was dangerous, that the only way to survive was to build increasingly higher walls. And then you appeared, with your brutal honesty and your refusal to let me hide, and you demolished all my defenses. And now?" He smiled, and in that smile there was a peace Thea had never seen, not even in their best moments together. "Now I have everything I never knew I needed. A partner who knows me in my worst moments and chooses to stay. A purpose that goes beyond numbers and business achievements. And this little one," he looked at Cordelia with a tenderness that completely transformed his normally serious features, "this little one who will remind us every day why it's worth being brave." Outside, dawn was beginning to paint New York's sky with the first pink tones of the new day. Inside the room, a newly formed family rested together, united not by contracts or obligations, but by something much more lasting. The love they had chosen to cultivate, day by day, through every storm and every celebration. Thea closed her eyes, letting the warm weight of her daughter and Sterling's constant presence lull her toward sleep. She had begun this journey as an anonymous employee with a secret love and an uncertain future. She ended it, or rather continued it, as a woman who had discovered that the most improbable circumstances can lead to the most beautiful destinies. Because true love, as Grandmother Cordelia had always said, isn't born in perfect moments. It grows in shared silences, in difficult mornings faced together, in small kindnesses no one else sees, and in the decision, made again and again, to choose each other against all odds. The light of dawn spread over the city, promising a new day full of possibilities yet to be discovered, and in that hospital room, 3 hearts beat in unison, writing the first chapter of a story that was just beginning, because endings, after all, are just new beginnings in disguise.